On June 28, 1519, in Frankfurt, the most powerful throne in Europe was sold to the highest bidder, and the auctioneer was a weaver's grandson from Augsburg named Jakob Fugger. The Holy Roman Empire, heir to Charlemagne's legacy, controller of Central Europe, theoretical leader of all Christendom, was up for sale because 3 men wanted to be emperor, and only one could afford Jakob Fugger's interest rates. The price tag, 850,000 florins, roughly 95 tons of pure gold, equivalent to about $400 million today. But here's the thing that should terrify you. Charles V, who won the auction, didn't have the money. He borrowed it all from Jakob Fugger, who was already so rich that this loan was just another Tuesday for him. One banker, one family, had become so wealthy that they could literally buy and sell empires. The Fuggers weren't just rich, they were richer than entire nations, controlled the Pope's finances, monopolised European metal markets, and knew every secret worth knowing through history's first corporate intelligence network. They were capitalism before capitalism existed, oligarchs before anyone knew what to call them, and they've been deliberately erased from history because their story reveals an uncomfortable truth. Democracy, monarchy, even theocracy, they're all for sale if you have enough gold. Chapter 1. From Weavers to World Bankers. Hans Fugger arrived in Augsburg in 1367 with a weaver's loom and a plan that would eventually make his family richer than God. Literally, since they would one day manage God's money through the Vatican. Hans was a village weaver from Graben, unremarkable except for one quality. He understood that information was more valuable than gold. Augsburg sat at the crossroads of European trade routes, where Italian merchants met German craftsmen, where news from Venice reached before anywhere else in Germany. Hans didn't just weave cloth, he wove himself into the information network, learning who needed what, when they needed it, and most importantly, what they'd pay for it. By the time Hans died in 1408, he'd transformed from a rural weaver into an urban merchant with enough wealth to leave his sons a thriving business. But it was his grandson, Jakob Fugger, born in 1459, who would transform a successful merchant family into the uncrowned kings of Europe. Jakob was the 10th of 11 children, originally destined for the church, a common path for younger sons with no inheritance prospects. But when several of his older brothers died unexpectedly, Jakob was pulled from religious training and thrown into the family business at age 14. This twist of fate would change the course of European history. Jakob's genius wasn't in working harder than his competitors, it was in working differently. While other merchant families focused on buying low and selling high, Jakob realised the real money was in controlling the entire chain from production to sale. When he took control of the family business in 1487, his first move wasn't to expand trade, but to secure monopolies. He didn't want to compete in markets, he wanted to own them. His target? The two most essential metals of the Renaissance, copper and silver. Copper for cannons and coins, silver for currency and trade. Control these and you controlled warfare and commerce. The two engines of power. The transformation began in Tyrol, where the Habsburg Archduke Sigismund was drowning in debt from failed military campaigns. The Tyrolean silver mines were the richest in Europe, but Sigismund couldn't afford to operate them. Jakob offered a devil's bargain. The Fuggers would loan Sigismund the money he desperately needed, taking the entire output of the mines as collateral. Not partial output, not profit sharing. Everything. Sigismund, desperate and short-sighted, agreed. Within 5 years, the Fuggers controlled the majority of European silver production. They didn't own the mines legally, but they owned everything that came out of them, which was better than ownership. It was control without responsibility. The copper monopoly was even more audacious. Jakob negotiated with the Kingdom of Hungary to manage their copper mines at Neusol, modern Banska Bystrica. The arrangement was revolutionary. The Fuggers would modernise the mines using new techniques from their Tyrolean operations, split the increased profits, but, and here was the genius, they would have exclusive rights to sell all the copper produced. Every pound of Hungarian copper had to go through Fugger warehouses at Fugger prices. They'd created a bottleneck in the European economy and positioned themselves as the valve. But controlling supply was only half the equation. Jakob needed to control demand too. He began lending to the people who needed copper most, kings preparing for war. When they couldn't repay in gold, he took payment in trade privileges, mining rights, and political favours. Each loan didn't just earn interest, it bought influence. The Fuggers weren't just bankers, they were creating a web of dependency that would eventually ensnare every throne in Europe. The key innovation that separated the Fuggers from medieval moneylenders was their adoption and perfection of double-entry bookkeeping, learned from their Italian partners. This wasn't just accounting, it was a technology that allowed them to track assets, liabilities, and profits across multiple countries, currencies, and ventures simultaneously. They could know their exact financial position at any moment, something no government of the time could do. A Fugger agent in Antwerp could write a bill of exchange drawable in Venice, backed by silver in Tyrol that hadn't even been mined yet. They were creating money from future production, inventing financial instruments that wouldn't be formally theorised for centuries. Jakob established Fugger counting houses in every major European city: Rome, Venice, Antwerp, Lisbon, Madrid, London, Krakow, Budapest. Each wasn't just a bank branch, but an information node. Fugger agents were instructed to report everything: troop movements, royal marriages, harvest yields, ship arrivals, even court gossip. This information flowed back to Augsburg, where Jakob could see patterns others couldn't. When he learned of Columbus's discovery of the Americas in 1493, he immediately cornered the European mercury market, knowing that mercury was essential for extracting silver from ore, and that massive new silver mines would soon need it. The Fugger communication network was faster than royal couriers. They used a relay system of riders and ships that could get information from Venice to Augsburg in under a week, remarkable for the 15th century. But more importantly, they coded their messages using ciphers that even royal spy masters couldn't break. The Fuggers knew about the outcome of battles before kings, about papal decisions before cardinals, about bankruptcies before creditors. This information asymmetry was worth more than all the silver in Tyrol. Chapter 2: The Monopoly Machine. By 1500, Jakob Fugger had stopped thinking like a merchant and started thinking like a sovereign power. The difference was crucial. Merchants competed in markets, but sovereign powers created markets. Jakob wasn't interested in competing. He was interested in controlling the entire economic architecture of Europe. His method was breathtakingly simple and absolutely ruthless. Identify essential commodities, monopolise their production, control their distribution, and then leverage that control into political power that protected and expanded the monopoly. It was a feedback loop of wealth and influence that no one had ever created at this scale. The Maestrazgos deal of 1525 exemplified the Fugger method perfectly. The Spanish crown controlled the Maestrazgos mines in Almaden, which produced mercury. essential for amalgamating silver from ore. Spain also controlled the vast silver mines of the New World, which needed that mercury. It should have been a perfect closed loop of Spanish wealth. But Charles V, now Holy Roman Emperor, thanks to Fugger loans, was perpetually bankrupt from his wars. He needed immediate cash, not future mercury revenues. Jakob offered to lease the Maestrazgos for an upfront payment, giving the Fuggers control of European mercury production to add to their near monopoly from the Idroja mines they already controlled in modern Slovenia. The genius wasn't just in controlling mercury, it was in controlling the entire vertical chain. The Fuggers now controlled the copper needed for bronze cannons, the silver needed for currency, and the mercury needed to extract that silver. They controlled the mines, the smelting facilities, the transportation networks, and the wholesale markets. They even controlled the mints in many cities, literally making the money. When a king wanted to wage war, he needed Fugger copper for weapons and Fugger silver for paying troops. When he couldn't pay, he borrowed from the Fuggers, securing the loan with future tax revenues or trade monopolies. The Fuggers had created a system where they profited from causing problems and then profited again from solving them. The spice trade showed another dimension of Fugger dominance. While the Portuguese controlled the sea routes to India, they needed someone to distribute spices throughout Europe. The Fuggers didn't sail to India. They didn't need to. They controlled the distribution networks within Europe so completely that Portuguese spices had to flow through Fugger warehouses to reach consumers. They took their cut without taking any of the risks of ocean voyages or colonial violence. They were the essential middlemen in a trade they didn't originate and never directly participated in. Jakob's most audacious monopoly play was his attempt to corner the entire European copper market in 1498. He formed a syndicate with other merchant houses, pooling resources to buy every pound of copper available. Within months, they controlled 80% of European copper stocks. Then they stopped selling. The price of copper tripled, then quadrupled. Cannon foundries shut down. Mints couldn't produce coins. Churches couldn't cast bells. The economic disruption was so severe that the Imperial Diet, the Holy Roman Empire's parliament, tried to pass anti-monopoly laws specifically targeting the Fuggers. Jakob's response was to loan the emperor enough money to override the Diet. The laws were never enforced. The control extended beyond raw materials to finished products and even to labour. The Fuggers employed over 100,000 people directly in their various enterprises: miners, smelters, guards, accountants, traders, ship captains. Entire cities like Fuggerei, modern Fuggerei, were company towns where the Fuggers controlled not just employment but housing, food supply, and even law enforcement. They had private armies to protect their shipments and enforce their contracts. In some regions, Fugger law superseded local law. They were creating corporate sovereignty centuries before the East India Companies. The financial innovations that supported these monopolies were revolutionary. The Fuggers invented what we now call futures contracts, agreements to deliver goods at set prices at future dates. They created complex derivatives that allowed them to hedge risks across multiple currencies and commodities. They pioneered international bond markets, packaging government debts and selling them to investors. They were essentially running a 16th century investment bank with a mining company attached, or perhaps vice versa. The distinctions became meaningless when you controlled everything. The accounting systems required to manage this empire were unprecedented. The Fuggers employed hundreds of bookkeepers using standardized methods across all their offices. Every transaction was recorded in massive ledgers that still exist today. thousands of pages documenting every florin that flowed through their hands. They could calculate profit margins on specific trade routes, return on investment for particular mines, even the cost-benefit of bribing specific officials. This wasn't just record-keeping, it was the birth of management science. But the real innovation was in how the Fuggers used debt as a tool of control. Unlike traditional moneylenders, who wanted loans repaid, the Fuggers preferred their debtors to remain in debt. A king who owed them money was a king they controlled. They would extend new loans to pay off old ones, adding new conditions each time. A trade monopoly here, a mining concession there. Charles V would eventually owe them over 4 million florins, a debt so large he could never repay it, which meant he could never defy them. The Fuggers had discovered that being owed money by the powerful was more valuable than actually having money. Chapter 3: Buying God and Emperor. The relationship between the Fuggers and the Catholic Church was the ultimate merger of sacred and profane, where spiritual authority met financial reality and money won. By 1500, Jakob Fugger had become the Vatican's primary banker, managing the transfer of church taxes from across Europe to Rome, financing papal wars, and most controversially, organising the sale of indulgences, the spiritual credit cards that would eventually trigger the Protestant Reformation. The Pope needed the Fuggers more than the Fuggers needed the Pope, and both parties knew it. When Pope Leo X wanted to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, he didn't pray for funds, he called Jakob Fugger. The indulgence trade was a masterpiece of spiritual financial engineering. The theological concept was that the Church held a treasury of merit, accumulated by Christ and the saints, which could be dispensed to reduce time in purgatory for sins. The practical reality was that this treasury needed a banker. The Fuggers didn't just transfer indulgence money to Rome, they organised the entire operation. They printed the indulgence certificates, distributed them to sellers, tracked sales, and ensured Rome got its cut while taking their own percentage. They were running God's franchise operation, complete with territories, quotas, and performance bonuses for top sellers. The most infamous indulgence campaign was for the Archbishopric of Mainz in 1514. Albrecht of Brandenburg wanted to become archbishop, but needed 29,000 florins to pay Rome for the position, essentially buying one of the most powerful religious offices in Germany. The Fuggers loaned him the money, but here's where it gets interesting. The loan was to be repaid from indulgence sales in Albrecht's territories. The Fuggers would manage the sales, take 50% off the top for loan repayment, and send the rest to Rome for St. Peter's construction. Every person buying their way out of purgatory was actually servicing a Fugger loan. It was this campaign that drove Martin Luther to nail his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door in 1517, specifically attacking the commercialization of salvation that the Fuggers had perfected. But the Fuggers' greatest political achievement was the Imperial election of 1519. When Emperor Maximilian I died, the Holy Roman Empire's throne wasn't hereditary. It was elective. 7 electors, 3 archbishops and 4 secular princes would choose the next emperor. 3 candidates emerged: Charles I of Spain, Maximilian's grandson, Francis I of France, and Henry VIII of England. What followed wasn't an election, it was an auction, and Jakob Fugger was the auctioneer. Francis I offered 300,000 florins in bribes to the electors. Henry VIII, relatively poor, dropped out early. Charles initially offered 450,000 florins, but he didn't have it. The Spanish treasury was empty from constant wars. Jakob Fugger saw an opportunity that went beyond mere profit. If he could make Charles emperor, he would have the most powerful man in Europe completely in his debt. Jakob not only loaned Charles the bribe money, but managed the entire operation. He didn't just provide funds, he provided intelligence on what each elector wanted, negotiated individual deals, and ensured the money reached the right hands at the right time. The final tally was staggering: 850,000 florins to secure the election, of which 543,000 came from the Fuggers. The Welser banking family and Italian bankers provided the rest, but Jakob controlled the consortium. The bribes were precisely calculated. The Archbishop of Mainz got 103,000 florins. The Archbishop of Cologne got 40,000. The Elector of Brandenburg got 42,000. Even the electors who were supposedly already supporting Charles got paid. Loyalty needed constant reinforcement. The Fuggers didn't just finance the election, they managed it like a modern political campaign, complete with opposition research and vote tracking. Charles V was elected emperor on June 28, 1519, but everyone knew who really won. Jakob Fugger had just bought the most powerful throne in Europe. The new emperor owed him so much money that the annual interest payments alone exceeded the revenues of many kingdoms. Charles would spend his entire reign trying and failing to escape Fugger control. Every war he fought, every alliance he made, every decision of significance had to consider what the Fuggers would think and whether they would finance it. Jakob made sure Charles never forgot who held the real power. In 1523, when Charles tried to delay loan repayments, Jakob wrote him a letter that was breathtaking in its audacity. No flowery language, no false deference, just brutal financial reality. It is well known that your Imperial Majesty could not have gained the Roman crown without me, and I can prove this with the written documents of your Majesty's agents given by your own hand. In this I have not looked after my own profit. If I had withdrawn from the House of Austria and had served France, I would have gained much money and property, as they offered to me. What disadvantage this would have been to your Majesty and the House of Austria, your Majesty can well conceive. This wasn't a subject writing to his emperor, this was a creditor reminding a debtor who really owned whom. The control extended beyond mere debt. The Fuggers became Charles's intelligence service, military suppliers, and diplomatic bankers. When Charles needed to bribe German princes to fight against Protestant rebels, Fugger gold did the bribing. When he needed to pay for wars against France, Fugger loans provided the funds. When he needed to communicate secretly with allies, Fugger couriers carried the messages. The Holy Roman Empire had essentially become a Fugger subsidiary, with Charles as a well-titled but ultimately powerless CEO who couldn't make a move without board approval. Chapter 4. Peak Power, Richer Than Nations. By 1525, Jakob Fugger's personal wealth exceeded 2 million florins, making him the richest private individual in European history up to that point. To put this in perspective, this was more than the annual revenues of most kingdoms. England's entire crown revenues were about 150,000 florins annually. The Kingdom of Portugal, despite its colonial empire, brought in perhaps 200,000 florins. Jakob Fugger personally could have bought several kingdoms and had change left over. Adjusted for economic output, his wealth would be equivalent to $400 to $500 billion today, making him richer than Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates combined. But raw wealth only tells part of the story. The Fuggers controlled approximately 50% of European copper production, 40% of silver production, and had effective monopolies on mercury and other strategic metals. They were the largest landowners in multiple regions, controlled the most extensive trading network in Europe, and employed more people than many national governments. They weren't just rich, they were systemically essential. If the Fuggers collapsed, European commerce would collapse with them. They had become, in modern terms, too big to fail. The Fugger newsletter system, initially created for commercial intelligence, had evolved into Europe's first news service. By the 1520s, Fugger agents weren't just reporting commodity prices and trade conditions, they were providing detailed political analysis, military intelligence, and social commentary. These handwritten newsletters, copied and distributed to paying subscribers, contained information that governments tried to keep secret. A merchant in Antwerp could learn about Ottoman troop movements before the Hungarian king. A banker in Venice could know about Spanish bankruptcy before Spanish nobles. The Fuggers were selling information as a commodity, creating an industry that wouldn't be formalised until newspapers emerged a century later. The reach of Fugger influence was demonstrated in their attempted colonisation of Venezuela. In 1528, Charles V, desperate for funds as always, granted the Fuggers colonial rights to Venezuela, then called Klein Venedig, Little Venice. The Fuggers sent German conquistadors to establish settlements, mine for gold, and potentially create their own colonial empire. It was an unprecedented moment. A private company granted sovereign rights over an entire territory. The venture ultimately failed due to disease, indigenous resistance, and Spanish colonial jealousy. But for a brief moment, the Fuggers weren't just financiers of empire, they were trying to become an empire themselves. Jakob's power was perhaps best displayed in small, personal moments that revealed how completely he transcended normal social hierarchies. When dining with Charles V, Jakob remained seated while the emperor stood, an unthinkable breach of protocol that Charles had to accept. When the Pope requested a loan, Jakob sent subordinates to negotiate, treating the Vicar of Christ like any other credit applicant. When German princes tried to pass laws restricting Fugger monopolies, Jakob simply bought enough influence in the Imperial Diet to have the laws killed in committee. He had transcended the traditional medieval order, where birth determined status. Money had become the new nobility, and Jakob had more of it than anyone. The Fugger counting house in Augsburg had become the de facto capital of European finance. Ambassadors visited it more often than many courts. Deals struck there determined the fate of nations. The building itself was a statement of power. The Fuggerei complex included not just offices, but the world's first social housing project, still operating today, demonstrating that the Fuggers could afford charity on a scale that governments couldn't match. The golden counting room where Jakob worked contained maps marking every Fugger office, mine and trade route, an empire drawn in ink and gold rather than blood and borders. The sophistication of Fugger operations by 1525 was centuries ahead of contemporary business practices. They had standardised employment contracts across all their offices. They provided retirement benefits for long-serving employees. They had systematic training programs for young clerks, creating a pipeline of skilled workers. They even had what we would recognise as corporate governance structures, with family members holding defined roles and outside advisors providing oversight. This wasn't a medieval merchant house anymore. It was a modern corporation operating in a medieval world. The peak of Fugger power came with the simple realisation they had won capitalism before anyone else knew they were playing. Every major transaction in Europe involved them somehow. Every government needed their services. Every ambitious merchant wanted their partnership. They had achieved monopolistic integration both vertically, controlling entire supply chains, and horizontally, controlling entire markets. They had more perfect market information than anyone else. They had more capital to deploy than anyone else. They had, in essence, cornered the European economy. Jakob Fugger died on December 30th, 1525, at age 66, working at his desk until the final day, still calculating interest rates as his body failed. He left behind a fortune of 2.1 million florins and a business empire that seemed indestructible. His nephew Anton Fugger took control, inheriting not just wealth, but systemic power that appeared unassailable. Yet within a generation, the Fugger Empire would begin its slow collapse, brought down not by competitors or revolutionaries, but by the very system they had created. They had become too successful, too essential, too big to survive in a world that was changing faster than their monopolies could adapt. The first crack came from an unexpected source. Their biggest debtor, Charles V, had learned to weaponize his own bankruptcy. In 1557, Philip II of Spain, Charles's son, declared the first of what would be many sovereign defaults. He owed the Fuggers 4.4 million florins, more than double Jakob's entire fortune at his death. But here was the trap the Fuggers had built for themselves. They couldn't afford to let Spain fail. If Spain collapsed, it would take the Fugger loans with it. So instead of cutting their losses, the Fuggers threw good money after bad, extending new loans to keep Spain afloat, hoping to eventually recover their investments. It was the sovereign debt trap, centuries before modern economists would name it. The Spanish bankruptcies of 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596 and 1607 were like repeated hammer blows to the Fugger fortune. Each time, they had to choose between writing off massive losses or extending new credit to protect old loans. Each time they chose to lend more, sinking deeper into Spanish quicksand. Philip II had discovered the debtor's ultimate power. When you owe the bank 1,000 florins, it's your problem. When you owe them 4 million florins, it's their problem. The Spanish crown had become too big to fail, and the Fuggers had to keep financing their own destruction. The Protestant Reformation, which the Fuggers had inadvertently helped trigger through their indulgence sales, was systematically destroying their revenue streams. Protestant territories stopped sending church taxes to Rome, eliminating the lucrative transfer fees. Monasteries were dissolved, ending another source of banking business. The new Protestant work ethic condemned the kind of monopolistic practices the Fuggers relied on as sinful usury. Cities that converted to Protestantism began passing and actually enforcing anti-monopoly laws. The Fuggers found themselves on the wrong side of a religious revolution that was also an economic revolution against everything they represented. But the deeper problem was that the Fugger business model required a medieval economy to function. They had perfected monopolistic control in a world of scarce information, limited capital markets, and restricted trade. But the world was changing. The discovery of massive silver deposits in Potosi, modern Bolivia, flooded Europe with Spanish silver, destroying the Fuggers' control over monetary metals. New banking houses in Genoa and Amsterdam were pioneering different models, joint stock companies that spread risk among many investors, rather than concentrating it in family firms. The Fuggers were a medieval monopoly, trying to survive in an early modern economy. Anton Fugger, who led the firm from 1525 to 1560, tried to adapt. He expanded into new markets, financing the Portuguese spice trade and even attempting to establish direct trade with Asia. But every expansion required more capital, and most of that capital was tied up in uncollectible Spanish debts. The Fuggers were asset-rich but cash-poor, the classic trap of overextended empires. They owned mines, lands and palaces across Europe, but they couldn't liquidate them fast enough to meet obligations. They had won the game of monopoly so thoroughly that they couldn't find buyers for their assets. Who else could afford to buy a copper monopoly? The family itself was changing in ways that undermined the business. Jakob had been childless, completely devoted to commerce, but his nephews and grandnephews had been raised in luxury, educated as Renaissance princes rather than merchants. They collected art, built magnificent palaces, and pursued noble titles. Max Fugger spent a fortune acquiring the county of Kirchberg to become a count. Hans Fugger built the magnificent Fugger castle at Kirchheim. They were transforming from bourgeois merchants into aristocrats, losing the sharp edge that had built the fortune. By the third generation, many Fuggers couldn't even read the complex account books their ancestors had perfected. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, delivered what should have been the death blow. The war devastated Germany, destroying many Fugger properties and making trade routes unusable. The city of Augsburg was occupied multiple times, each army demanding tribute the Fuggers had to pay. But somehow the firm limped on, too embedded in European finance to simply disappear. They had become financial zombies, not really alive but unable to die. Creditors couldn't foreclose because the Fuggers owed too much to too many. Their collapse would trigger a financial crisis nobody wanted. The transformation from merchant bankers to rentier aristocrats was complete by 1650. The Fuggers still existed, but they were no longer innovating or expanding. They lived off rents from their remaining properties, interest from government bonds, and the slowly diminishing proceeds of their industrial holdings. They had gone from creating wealth to merely preserving it, from shaping Europe's economy to being shaped by it. The counting house in Augsburg, once the nerve centre of European capitalism, became a museum of past glory, where elderly clerks maintained books that fewer and fewer people consulted. The Fugger legacy isn't in the family that bears the name. They still exist, minor nobles living comfortable but unremarkable lives in Bavaria. The real legacy is in the system they created, the corporate DNA they injected into European capitalism that mutated and spread until it became the economic order we inhabit today. The Fuggers didn't just participate in early capitalism, they invented many of its essential features. Every multinational corporation, every too-big-to-fail bank, every vertically integrated monopoly owes something to innovations the Fuggers pioneered in their counting house in Augsburg. Consider what the Fuggers invented or perfected. Double-entry bookkeeping at scale, international wire transfers, corporate intelligence networks, futures contracts, currency arbitrage, sovereign debt markets, vertical integration, regulatory capture, and corporate social responsibility. The Fuggerei social housing project. These weren't incremental improvements on existing practices. They were revolutionary innovations that created modern capitalism's infrastructure. When business schools teach corporate strategy today, they're teaching methods Jakob Fugger invented through trial and error 500 years ago. The Fugger approach to monopoly, control the essential commodity, vertically integrate the supply chain, use political influence to protect market position, became the playbook for every robber baron and tech billionaire. When John D. Rockefeller created Standard Oil's monopoly, he was following the Fugger copper model. When Amazon pursues vertical integration from production to delivery, they're executing Jacob's vision. When Google uses data advantage to maintain market dominance, They're employing the same information asymmetry the Fuggers pioneered with their newsletter network. The concept of too big to fail that dominates modern economic policy was born with the Fuggers. They were the first private entity to become so systematically important that their failure would cascade through the entire economy. When modern central banks bail out major financial institutions, they're acknowledging a principle the Fuggers proved. Some economic actors become so essential that their private failure becomes public catastrophe. The Spanish crown couldn't let the Fuggers fail, even as the Fuggers couldn't let Spain fail. Mutually assured financial destruction, centuries before nuclear weapons, made the concept literal. The Fuggers also pioneered corporate political influence at a scale that makes modern lobbying look quaint. They didn't just influence policy, they wrote it. They didn't just fund politicians, they created them. Charles V was essentially a Fugger employee with an impressive title. When modern corporations use campaign contributions and lobbying to shape legislation, they're using tools the Fuggers forged. The difference is that modern corporations have to work through democratic institutions and public opinion. The Fuggers simply bought the institutions outright. But perhaps the most modern aspect of the Fugger story is how it's been erased from popular history. Every American schoolchild learns about the Medici, who were never as rich or powerful as the Fuggers. The Rothschilds are synonymous with banking wealth, but they were following a path the Fuggers had already travelled. This erasure isn't accidental, it's systematic. The Fuggers represented capitalism without moral justification, wealth without social purpose, power without responsibility. They showed that money could buy anything: empires, popes, even historical memory. That's not a story modern capitalism once told. The deliberate forgetting of the Fuggers began almost immediately after their decline. The Habsburg records were sanitized to minimize how dependent the empire had been on one banking family. The Catholic Church certainly didn't want to emphasize how the Reformation had been triggered by their financial partnership with the Fuggers. The emerging nation-states of Europe preferred narratives of royal power and national destiny, not stories of German bankers pulling the strings. Even in Augsburg, the Fugger legacy was downplayed as the city reinvented itself. Too much truth about the Fuggers revealed too much truth about how power really works. Modern parallels to the Fuggers are everywhere but unacknowledged. When Apple holds more cash reserves than most national treasuries, when BlackRock manages assets larger than most economies, when tech companies know more about citizens than governments do, we're seeing Fugger-level concentration of private power. The difference is that we've normalised it, created ideological justifications for it, convinced ourselves that this time it's different. The Fuggers at least were honest about what they were: merchants who had become more powerful than princes. Modern equivalents hide behind corporate structures, shareholder obligations, and market rhetoric. The Fugger story also previews the life cycle of capitalist empires. Innovation and ambition create the fortune. Monopolistic practices and political influence protect it. Generational wealth and systemic importance perpetuate it. But eventually the very success becomes the vulnerability. The monopoly becomes too rigid to adapt. The political connections become liabilities when regimes change. The wealth breeds complacency in inheritors. The system that created the fortune evolves beyond it. Every dominant corporation today is somewhere on the Fugger trajectory. The only question is whether they're in Jakob's ascent or Anton's decline. The numbers tell the final story. At their peak around 1525, The Fuggers controlled wealth equivalent to 2% of European GDP. No private entity has matched that level of economic dominance since. The Gilded Age robber barons came close. Rockefeller at his peak controlled perhaps 1.5% of American GDP. Modern tech billionaires don't even reach 0.5% of global GDP. The Fuggers weren't just rich, they were systemically dominant in a way that modern antitrust laws are specifically designed to prevent. They showed what happens when private power has no public check. The Fuggers invented modern capitalism, but also demonstrated its ultimate contradiction. Perfect capitalist success destroys capitalism itself. When one player wins completely, the game ends. The Fuggers achieved monopolistic dominance so complete that they eliminated a competition that drives innovation, the creative destruction that renews economies, the mobility that justifies inequality. They won capitalism, and in winning, broke it. The system had to evolve beyond them or die with them. Today we're arguably approaching similar concentration levels, just distributed across multiple tech giants rather than one family firm. The combined market power of Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook increasingly resembles the systemic dominance the Fuggers achieved. They control essential infrastructure, digital rather than metal, possess superior information, influence governments, and have become too big to fail. The question isn't whether we're repeating the Fugger story, but whether we'll learn from how it ended, with the monopolists destroyed by the very system they'd perfected. One family, that's all it took. One family from Augsburg controlled more wealth than entire kingdoms, bought the Holy Roman Emperor like a wholesale commodity, turned the Pope into a client, and invented the corporate playbook that every billionaire still follows today. The Fuggers didn't just participate in capitalism, they created it, perfected it, and then were destroyed by it when they became so successful that success itself became failure. At their peak, they controlled 2% of Europe's entire economy. No private entity has ever matched that dominance since, though not for lack of trying. Every robber baron, every tech mogul, every too-big-to-fail bank is chasing the ghost of Jakob Fugger, the weaver's son who bought empires. But here's what should keep you up at night. We've forgotten them on purpose. The Fuggers have been erased from popular history because their story reveals capitalism's darkest truth. That democracy, monarchy, theocracy, any system of government is just window dressing on plutocracy when enough wealth concentrates in few enough hands. They prove that everything is for sale if you have enough gold. Emperors, popes, laws, armies, even history itself. And we're watching it happen again, just with different names and digital instead of metal monopolies. When 5 tech companies control the infrastructure of modern life, when private wealth exceeds national treasuries, when corporations write the laws that regulate them, we're not witnessing something new. We're watching the Fugger playbook execute itself again. If this story kept you watching, if you need to know more about the puppet master's history tried to hide, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Because every age has its Fuggers, the ones who realise that while everyone else is playing the game, they can buy it. The only difference between then and now is that Jakob Fugger was honest about what he was. Today's equivalents hide behind foundations, political action committees and press releases about changing the world. But the game remains the same. Monopolise the essential, capture the regulators, become too big to fail, and hope you die before the bill comes due. Subscribe now and discover more stories about those who didn't just win capitalism, they broke it, and us with it.